Canadians need to start having more kids. We shouldn't be shy about that fact. We should all be more pro-family, pro-kids, and pro-mothers. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast today. So as you saw in recent weeks and months, and with the budget being rolled out by the Trudeau Liberals, part of what they've announced is that they've reached a deal with all of the provinces to introduce a $10 per day childcare program. This is modeled after the Quebec public daycare program. So we now have government daycares all over the country rolling out. Many people are celebrating this fact. Many people, even on the right, are excited about the idea that more mothers will be able to get back into the workforce and that they'll have a place to put their kids. It may even encourage families to have more kids. I found this incredibly arrogant. Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister in the House of Commons, called this policy women's liberation, an example of feminist policy in action. So I want to quickly play that clip for you. Here it is.
We have now signed agreements on early learning and childcare with every single province and territory in our great country. This is women's liberation. It will mean more women no longer need to choose between motherhood and a career. This is feminist economic policy in action, and it will make life more affordable for middle-class Canadian families.
So Chrystia Freeland very boldly says that women will no longer have to choose between having a family or having a career, as if that is really the major struggle that women in today's world have. Well, someone who writes about this issue and speaks very clearly on it is Ginny Ross. So I wanted to invite her on the podcast today to discuss it. Ginny is the vice president at Crestview Strategy. She's worked at Queen's Park, was a party organizer for the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, and has been a lifelong political activist. She's a contributor over at The Hub. She writes occasionally for the National Post and is a frequent panelist on television and radio outlets. Ginny, it's great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Candice.
So, well, first, I just want to get your quick reaction on the government $10 a day government daycare, whether you think that will, as Chrystia Freeland claims, sort of solve women's liberation and allow women to have it all, have both family and career, as so many women struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, I find it offensive on a number of fronts, and maybe it's worth going through them because I think they're all important. One is, well, first there's the policy matter, which is, will the program even work? Like, will there actually be all these new childcare spaces that are affordable for people of different incomes across Canada? And I think we have all sorts of reasons to be skeptical of that. If you look at the Quebec model that they're trying to imitate or bring across the country, there's massive wait lists for it. It's hurt people who want a different option for childcare and can't go with the 9 to 5 because they work different hours. Maybe they're a shift worker, whatever. So there's almost no flexibility. The actual program itself, there have been studies that the outcome for children aren't great. So there are all sorts of reasons why it's bad public policy. Even if you believe that it will increase flexible childcare, which I don't, her comments around the premise of, first of all, women's liberation. I mean, I think most women in Canada feel pretty liberated. I don't know that people feel there's like an academic epidemic of women being held down by public policy in Canada. Second of all, and it's sort of the same point, I think you and I both, I won't speak for my husband. I follow your husband. I know a lot of other men who are really active in their kids' lives who also want better childcare options. Like, it's a very strange thing to make this about women when in a lot of cases, you have parents who are making choices about their lives, who want more flexibility, who want more options. And yes, maybe both want to pursue careers and have a way of having their children cared for while they work. But what does that say about those men who are really active in many cases in their kids' lives, that childcare doesn't have anything to do with them, seemingly, according to the federal finance minister? So, I mean, I could go on, but there are so many ways that I find that a problematic comment from her relative to the program.
Yeah, and it's funny too because I talked to a lot of my female friends about this. The idea that women can have it all. We can have successful careers that are meaningful and fulfilling, and then we can also have these meaningful, fulfilling family lives with great supportive husbands and children. And it's sort of a paradox because when you become a parent, you realize that your time is limited, and so the actual struggle is where do you want to put your time? Do you want to spend more of your time in a day job that you might not even get a lot of satisfaction from, you might not even love, and you're foregoing time with your children, these like incredibly important fleeting moments where they're learning to talk and speak and walk and all these milestones. And so this idea that, oh, the government solved the problem, all you have to do is just drop your kid off at some government daycare and voila, like your life will be happy. It's insulting, and even more so to your point that it excludes men from the conversation because it's expected that men are going to be working and that it's women that have to make this struggle. I want to ask you about a piece that you wrote over at the Hub. I thought it was really interesting. You said, don't be shy about it. Family values and babies are good things. You talked a little bit about how there's a revitalization, particularly on the right, with natalism and this people having more conversations about how we need to have more kids, we should have more kids, and we shouldn't be shy about it. But how elite opinion sort of, the experts don't want to talk about it because it's irky and it's personal. What made you want to champion this issue, and what makes you so confident and brave to go out there and speak about it?
I was sort of triggered by a series of Paul Krugman tweets that I mentioned in the story, and people should check it out. But it was sort of this analysis that, and I think this is true of lots of sort of like centrist thinkers, of which most economists would consider themselves centrists, I think, or maybe left of center, and liberals who think that the only thing that matters when it comes to families and their size are sort of like economic measures and this question of like people in the workforce, and that because we've now put women in the workforce, that means we have equality or we're trying to achieve equality. Therefore, birth rates have dropped, and that makes it okay. And the only people, according to Krugman, who want to see birth rates go up are people who are religious, God forbid. So my reaction to that was just so visceral because I had, in following this issue, noticed that actually there are some really strong demographers who've studied the issue in great detail, and no one has a perfect answer to why birth rates are dropping basically all over the world. But what we do know is that when you ask people, they want to have more kids than they're having. And that includes women. It's especially true of women. To an earlier point you were making, many women would choose to stay home. Many people would choose to stay home if they could afford to, if they could have a single family home. There's a candidate for Senate in Arizona right now named Blake Masters, who's running on this premise of imagine if you could support a family on one income. And I think what he does with his political messaging is really smart and correct. What's part of what I tried to do in my column, which is we don't need to choose between an economic policy solution or a social policy solution. It's both, right? Our culture and our social environment, which dictate the public policy choices we make, are what impact these kinds of big macro trends. And if we think that people aren't having enough kids, which I think we can all agree that the goal of public policy is to give people better, more fulfilled, happier lives, and they're telling us in surveys they want more kids than they're having, there's obviously a problem there. And what he gets at with his messaging is maybe there's a cost of living challenge. Maybe in Canada, we know inflation's a big problem. We know people can, in many cases, parents are choosing not to buy beef at the grocery store right now because groceries are so expensive. They're opting not to fill their car with gas. And so those material challenges, plus a culture that is telling women that they're not fulfilling their duty unless they're working for some sort of feminist cause, I think those things are starting to pile up, and they're starting to really influence the choices people are making. And ultimately, people are making choices they're not happy with, and they're having fewer kids. And by the time they decide they maybe want to have more, they're disappointed in that it's too late because there are imperatives we don't like to talk about, biological imperatives we don't like to talk about because it's uncomfortable. But I think we should, because if people aren't achieving their desired birth rate, that's a problem for their happiness and their fulfillment and for society.
Well, you can look at surveys tracking women's happiness in particular. I mean, across society, our society is becoming less and less happy and fulfilled, self-reporting. But women in particular is gone down markedly. And I know for my generation, it was like go to college, get a career, exactly what you're saying, women's liberation. It's like your duty to go out and put career first. And then you get to the point where you're like, well, I've gone to university, I've put all this energy and investment into my career. I need to go fulfill that. And I know that so many women that go off and find careers that they hate and then they're unhappy with, and really high level, high achieving people, lawyers, doctors, those kind of things, and they realize it's not really what they want. So fundamentally, I think it is cultural, but there is that economic component. I hear more and more conservatives talking about how Canada needs to get to a place where a family can survive on one income. That seems so foreign, especially in a city like Toronto, where I think the average home is now like $2 million or something like that. So many families are working so hard with two incomes just to save up to buy a house, or to the point you're making, these crazy times with inflation, buying gas and buying meat. I mean, I think a lot of people put off childhood, having kids, motherhood, parenthood, because they can't afford it, or they think they need those two incomes. So what do you think we're just beyond the point now where a single income household can sustain? I mean, I grew up in a household where my dad worked and my mom was a stay-at-home mom and she never had a job. And that was kind of the norm in my community in Vancouver, I guess in the 80s and 90s. It doesn't seem like anyone does that anymore. Every family I know, every couple I know has a two working spouses or two working parents. Do you think we can get back to that place where we have an economy where you only need one income to survive?
I do. It seems a long way off. I mean, to your point, I think there are many people with two incomes who can't afford a home, let alone one. But I think it's a laudable goal. And I think more importantly, we need to discipline the public conversation around this issue. I think the vast majority of people who speak publicly on public policy would say, well, the federal government especially, but governments in general just can't impact something like a birth rate. It's too hard. Social policy is really narrow, and it's the purview of local governments at most. But we shouldn't be interfering in people's bedrooms and that kind of thing. But I think we need to be more clear with people about the fact that economic policy, like a policy, and then they're all choices, by the way. Like the housing crisis exists because of choices that politicians have made to favor NIMBYism and people who don't want to see new homes built over people who are shut out of the housing market. That's a choice. Public policymakers make that choice every day, and you could apply that to all sorts of some of the policy choices that led to the inflationary situation we're in right now, not just on homes but on other fronts. All of these public policy choices have implications, and I think that they are having an impact on at least how open Canada is as a country to, or how encouraging that Canada is as a country to people to grow their families and pursue their dreams that we know that they want. And so it does seem far off, but I think it's possible. And I think our body politic should pressure politicians to try to speak to that. And I think politicians who are trying to speak to that are going to find that it's fertile ground for them politically, because they're going to speak to people who have been making certain choices about their lives because they think politicians don't have answers. And all of a sudden they'll realize, actually, there may be public policy that could change this. If I could all of a sudden afford a house, maybe I'd have a second kid, maybe I'd have a third kid.
Absolutely. And, it's definitely intertwined there. Are there any examples of pro-family, pro-natal policies around the world that have worked? Anecdotally, I was in Singapore like 10 years ago, and they had this like weird campaign where they were trying to encourage people to have babies, and they had like kind of almost creepy billboards up. I think they had like a national date night or something where they were like encouraging parents to go out and go on dates and make babies, essentially. I don't know if that was actually successful or not. I'm wondering if you've looked into this at all and if you know of any.
Most demographers are pretty agreed that these kind of experiments aren't working very well. The one exception and outlier is Hungary, which people on the right of center know Hungary as this kind of like nationalist, really right-wing government that's sort of like the example of a right-wing nationalist government, really pushing forward lots of public policy, new public policy in the last, say, 5 years, 5 years certainly. And they have actually increased their birth rate, and they're like very explicit about you basically pay no taxes if you have more than like 4 or 5 kids in Hungary. They've chosen to really like lower the burden and try to incentivize through financial means people having kids. And It has made a bit of a difference, so it is possible. That's a pretty like blunt instrument. I think that whether or not you get the result you want, I still think the public policy choices we make and the way leaders talk culturally about what's important and what's not matters and sends signals to people. I'll jump back really quickly to a point you were making about what it was like for art. I think we are from a similar generation growing up. And for me, from my generation growing up in a pretty atheistic urban environment, it was just not viewed as something that a young woman should want to grow a family and to have kids. And I think you're now seeing a trend of, frankly, like a business market for the fertility industry, not just the obvious medical interventions to try to increase people's fertility, which they should obviously pursue, but like devices even to track your ability to get pregnant later in life, and this whole marketplace of capitalizing on women who in their mid or late 30s are choosing to have kids. And it's great that they are, but in many cases, I think certainly anecdotally, you're starting to hear people women who didn't really quite realize that the choices they've made would mean that their childbearing would be delayed and then tougher, and that it may not be possible for them to have the big families that they want. And I think that's a bit of a failure on the public policy front too. If we've created a public health education environment where women don't know what their most fertile years are, it's uncomfortable to talk about, but I think that's a problem. And I think we owe it to people to make sure they have all the information they need to make the best possible choice. They should have better material economic circumstances, better information, and they should feel like they can make the best possible choice to pursue a happy end that they see for themselves.
Well, just again, speaking anecdotally from like my friend group, it seems like everyone focused so much on education and career development in their 20s, and then 30s was a time that they started having kids. And it's just objectively harder to have kids when you're in your 30s because you're a little bit older, and you talk about all of these devices. You track your ovulation cycles and that kind of thing. There's also been a huge boom in IVF treatments. I know in Ontario it's paid for by the government, but they're still privately run, and there's clinics kind of popping up everywhere because so many people kind of, again, just didn't realize how difficult it might be to have children in their 30s. I know, again, just from my group of friends, some families that have struggled with that and struggled to have kids and end up going the adoption route. I see some hope because I have some friends that are also in their 20s and some colleagues, and I see them having kids earlier. And it's sort of, to me, reassuring that maybe that messaging has changed a little bit, although I don't know if that's just very niche and that most women are continuing on that same path of focusing on career in their 20s and then trying to have a family in their 30s. I wonder in Canada, I have another friend from Denmark, and she's talking about how they get paid to have kids. The government actually gives them like a bonus, and this idea of like, maybe if you have a big family, you shouldn't pay income taxes, or you should have a different tax structure. Do you think that something like that could work in Canada? And do you see anyone talking about it? I know there's a conservative leadership race going on right now, or any of the candidates talking about it. Is this something that you've heard come up at all?
I mean, it kind of exists in Canada. This was a Stephen Harper policy innovation that the Liberals have actually continued. They don't talk about it a lot, but Stephen Harper came up with sending parents checks in the mail as a way, and frankly, it was in response to the Liberal sort of cradle to grave. The only option we can dream of to encourage people to have kids is to sort of institutionalize childcare. And infamously, when Stephen Harper first floated the idea of people giving back cash to parents instead to make their own choices, to spend, to maybe give to a grandparent to care for the kid, to subsidize the grandparent's income, or to a neighbor, or to defray the cost of staying home for a stay-at-home parent. A Liberal strategist infamously said people would spend it on beer and popcorn, which I think tells you everything you need to know about Liberals thinking people can better spend their own money. But actually, American demographers look to the Harper example as something that can work. And Biden did something similar very recently, like near the tail end of COVID, as part of his stimulus. A big part of it was, and he was, he worked with Mitt Romney and other right, of Senate legislators in the U.S. To send people cash, people who were either pregnant and expecting a child, or who had a young child at home, as a way of kind of encouraging people to and rewarding people for making that choice in the context of COVID, and or rewarding is the wrong word, more like not penalizing them for making that choice or removing the penalty and making it a bit easier. I have all sorts of commentary on Biden stimulus spending, which I think is part of the problem with inflation. But it is clear that there was a little mini baby boom after those checks were delivered, because it gave people a bit of material comfort that, coming out of COVID, they might be able to afford to make that choice to have that baby. And this is consistent with what demographers have found, which is that material support can help a little bit, but not all the way. There are other cultural factors at play. And if you can defray some of the cost or give some people some money back in their pocket to feel like it won't be such a penalty to have a kid, and that's really what it is, removing the penalty of having a kid, it can make a difference. There is still this persistent challenge of dropping birth rates in most Western countries around the world. And that extra cultural gap, most people attribute to like declining religiosity, increased workism, as they call it, which is sort of like what you described, this fixation on building your career before you have kids. And I think that, and to the point of my column, I think that has to be addressed by culture, by leaders encouraging people to pursue the way of life that they want. But the material can help. It can make a difference at the margins.
It's interesting that Biden took a sort of a page from Harper, although it's interesting just to note that, so Harper introduced the childcare benefit as an alternative to government daycare. Trudeau kept it and expanded it, and then in addition also brought in government daycare. So we now have two policy solutions trying to address the same problem. I've always been interested in this sort of difference between the Canadian model and the American model, because it's sort of an experiment playing out in real time. And my sister lives in the US. I've got a bunch of friends down there. And it's really interesting because most companies don't give extended maternity leave. The government doesn't mandate it. I have so many friends that literally 6 weeks after the baby is born and they're back at their desk. And, for anyone who's been around a 6-week-old baby, that's kind of shocking that that's what mothers do. But what I find in the US is that it's much more binary. Like, so many women just don't go back to work. It's just, that's the decision. Once they start having kids, it's like they're unwilling to go back to work because they're not going to go back that early and they don't like the options. Whereas in Canada, we have this very generous year-long maternity leave program, and it's great for moms. They don't have to worry about it. Some of them even take longer. I think some government jobs you can take up to 2 years or up to a year and a half, and they hold your position, which seems on the surface very pro-mother, pro-family. But then you get to the problem where, the child is 2 and 3, and the mother feels the need to go back to her career. She doesn't want to lose that job, but then at the same time, there's not a good place to leave the kid. And I guess that's the solution that Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau are touting here. I'm just wondering, as someone who spends time thinking about this, do you think the Canadian model is objectively better, or do you think that perhaps there's problems with it that we don't see because we like to think of ourselves as more generous and more, in this regard, pro-mother, but I don't know if necessarily that's the case, and I think the U.S. still has higher birth rates than Canada does.
Yeah, I don't know that it's better from a direct birth rate perspective. I think it's better if your goal, and I think this is my goal, is to get more to a greater neutrality that doesn't penalize parents for choosing to stay home, because the longer the leave you offer, to a point, the more I think people feel like they don't have to make that binary choice so early in a baby's life, and I think that's good. I think that's like a good in and of itself. And I think it plays out in positive ways in Canada. But what the problem comes when you have legislators using the kind of language Freeland did, where you start to talk about like the moralism of women going back to work in every single instance, or parents going back to work in every single instance, because it starts to creep into public policy decision making that the goal isn't to give people choice or flexibility or to be neutral about childbearing. The public policy goal is to get as many people working as possible, because people are just, GDP contributing units of economic input. And that is the true end of gender equality. That is when I start to get really uncomfortable. And I worry that constant enhancements and fixation on cradle to grave childcare policy are in pursuit of that end, as opposed to the end of women and men and parents in general making the best choice for their family and for what's going to make them the happiest and contribute the most to like a thriving society and culture in Canada.
Well, it reminds me of another piece you had in the Hub last year, where you were talking about conservatives, and you wrote this: a conservative feminism should drop labor force participation as the only measure of gender equality. You argued that the Liberal approach has failed and that not all women are interested in full-time work, nor is it best for their families. So just final question for you. Can you elaborate? And how do you think conservative feminism, if you want to use that term, what should it focus on instead of labor force equality?
I think I'll repeat myself a little bit just to say that I think it should focus on women having true choices to contribute to their family, society, and the workplace in the way that they think is best. I think our society should reward caring work, whether that's caring for older people and seniors, or babies and kids, or just each other. Whether that's caring for your own kids or caring for someone else's kids, which often those kind of flexible, your neighbor caring for your kids, often those people are women, and they're not rewarded by a childcare cradle to grave, institutional childcare system. And so, and I think it's okay that women, for whatever reason, choose some of those caring roles in society more often than men do. I think conservative feminism looks like a public policy environment that doesn't penalize women for making choices that they think are best for themselves and their families. And I don't think the Liberal policy framework does that.
Well, Ginny, I really appreciate you coming on the show. There's so many interesting areas when it comes to family policy that don't get the proper attention in the media and in society. So it's great to have this conversation. Hopefully we can start having more and more of these kinds of conversations, because it's so important. So I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on True North.
Thanks, Candice.
All right, that's Ginny Roth. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.